There is a stretch of riverfront in Rock Island, Illinois, where the Mississippi bends past a parking lot that used to be a factory floor. 49 acres of it once. 1.5 million square feet under one roof, 3 stories of it in places, and on the side of the building, in letters tall enough to read from a passing barge, the word that meant something to every farmer between Ohio and the Rockies: International. The paint that came off that line was red, not just any red, Farmall red, the color International Harvester committed to in 1936, and then dressed up 3 years later with a Raymond Loewy design, the color that told a neighbor everything he needed to know about which dealer you trusted and which company you believed in. The building is gone now. It was torn down in 2009, hauled away as scrap and rubble, and today a body panel manufacturer occupies a quarter of the old footprint, while the rest of it is grass and asphalt. The red is gone from the landscape here. The company that made it is gone too. To understand why a parking lot in Rock Island matters to a 68-year-old man in Nebraska who never set foot in Illinois, you have to go back further than the Farmall, further than the color red, back to a feud that nearly broke American agriculture before it built it. The man at the center of it was born in 1809 on a farm in Rockbridge County, Virginia, the son of a man who had himself spent decades trying and failing to build a working mechanical reaper. Cyrus Hall McCormick inherited his father's obsession, and where his father failed, he succeeded. In 1831, he field demonstrated a reaper of his own design, and in 1834, he patented it. By 1847, with the grain country of the Midwest calling louder than the worn-out tobacco land of Virginia, McCormick and his brother Leander moved to Chicago, then a lake port of fewer than 30,000 people, and founded the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company. He developed a vast support network to demonstrate field operations, and the machine sold well enough that by the time Cyrus McCormick died in 1884, the company he left to his son Cyrus Jr. was the dominant reaper manufacturer in the country. It was not, however, the only one. Across town, a Maine textile man named William Deering had left the cloth business behind to build his own harvester company. And through the 1880s and 1890s, McCormick and Deering fought what the industry itself came to call the Harvester Wars, a vicious battle in which sales representatives of the two giants tried every trick possible to sell their binders to reluctant farmers, allegedly bribing customers and even sabotaging competitors' machines. Selling costs climbed past 40% of total revenue as the two companies bled each other dry on the same fields they were supposed to be harvesting. Cyrus McCormick's own management of labor had already left scars on the city that built his fortune. A strike at his reaper works in 1886 helped touch off the violence that became known as the Haymarket Affair, the bloody Chicago confrontation that gave the modern world May Day as a labor holiday, a grim foreshadowing of the labor conflict that would, nearly a century later, help bring the company he founded to its knees. It took a banker to end a farm war. In the summer of 1902, in hotel rooms and the Wall Street offices of J.P. Morgan & Company, a young partner named George W. Perkins worked out the terms that neither family had been able to negotiate on their own. The McCormicks held roughly 43% of the new combined company, the Deerings just over a third, with Morgan and the 3 smaller firms splitting the remainder. The International Harvester Company was established on August 12, 1902, combining McCormick and Deering with 3 smaller firms, Milwaukee Harvester, Plano Manufacturing, and Warder, Bushnell, and Glessner, makers of the Champion line. The new company controlled assets in excess of $110 million and held nearly 85% of harvester and reaper production in the United States. It was Perkins, the story goes, who suggested the name itself, a nod to the fact that both families already knew their future lay overseas as much as in Illinois. International Harvester did not invent the tractor. For its first 2 decades, the company was still a harvester and binder maker first, selling stationary engine-on-wheels machines under the McCormick dealer network as the Mogul and under the Deering network as the Titan. International Harvester's first tractor went on sale in 1905, and by 1910, its Mogul and Titan models accounted for 1/3 of the USA's total tractor production. But the machine that would define the company, the one that would put a specific shade of red on more American farms than any other tractor color in history, did not arrive until 1924, when International Harvester introduced a lightweight general-purpose row crop machine and gave it a name that would outlive the parent company by decades, the Farmall. What happened to that name, 60 years later, is the decision that every implement dealer between Sioux Falls and Springfield had feared for the better part of a decade, and when it finally came, it arrived exactly as they had feared it would, not with a bankruptcy notice, but with a strike. We'll get there. First, you need to understand what the company built while it still had the chance, and what color it was. For the first dozen years of its life, the Farmall did not wear red at all. The original 1924 machine and the F-Series that followed it came off the line in a color so often mistaken for battleship gray that even people who owned one sometimes described it wrong. It was in fact a bluer, steel-toned gray, with the wheels painted red almost as an afterthought.
In mid-1936, with Alice Chalmers already turning heads with its bright orange and the competitive pressure to be seen from a moving car growing each season, International Harvester's management made the decision that would define the brand for the rest of its existence. The entire tractor, frame, sheet metal, engine, and wheels alike, would be painted a single, deliberate red. The trade called it Farmall Red. The idea, as plain as it sounds, was advertising. A farmer could look out across his own fields, see his neighbor's tractor working a half-mile off, and know exactly what make it was without reading a single word of a nameplate. 3 years after that color decision, the look caught up to the paint. International Harvester brought in Raymond Loewy, the same designer who would later shape the Coca-Cola bottle, the Greyhound Scenic Cruiser, and Air Force One, to give the company's tractors a modern silhouette to match their modern color. On August 9, 1939, at a Farmall Day celebration held appropriately enough in Rock Island, Illinois, IH introduced the Loewy-styled Farmall H and M, the start of what came to be called the letter series. Loewy gave the H its distinctive silver pinstriping and three-dimensional nameplate, designed the offset Cultivision seating that let a driver see his row ahead of him rather than over the engine, and, in 1946, designed the IH logo itself, a lowercase I set inside an uppercase H, meant deliberately to suggest the silhouette of a man driving a tricycle front Farmall. That logo would still be visible, slanted and slightly altered, on Case IH equipment built decades after the company that commissioned it had stopped existing. The letter series became the best-selling tractor lineup in American history. Between 1939 and 1954, International Harvester built more than 1 million letter series Farmalls. The H alone, a modest two-plow machine aimed at the 100-acre farmer still transitioning off horses, sold somewhere around 390,000 to 420,000 units depending on how the later Super H variants are counted, at prices that started around $850 and climbed toward $1,650 by the early 1950s. Only the Ford 8N, helped along by Ford's economies of scale and a lower sticker price, ever outsold it in North America. The Farmall H remains to this day the best-selling row crop tractor ever built by any manufacturer.
For the first dozen years of its life, the Farmall did not wear red at all. The original 1924 machine and the F-Series that followed it came off the line in a color so often mistaken for battleship gray that even people who owned one sometimes described it wrong. It was in fact a bluer, steel-toned gray, with the wheels painted red almost as an afterthought. In mid-1936, with Alice Chalmers already turning heads with its bright orange and the competitive pressure to be seen from a moving car growing every season, International Harvester's management made the decision that would define the brand for the rest of its existence. The entire tractor, frame, sheet metal, engine, and wheels alike, would be painted a single, deliberate red. The trade called it Farmall Red. The idea, as plain as it sounds, was advertising. A farmer could look out across his own fields, see his neighbor's tractor working a half-mile off, and know exactly what make it was without reading a single word of a nameplate. 3 years after that color decision, the look caught up to the paint. International Harvester brought in Raymond Loewy, the same designer who would later shape the Coca-Cola bottle, the Greyhound Scenic Cruiser, and Air Force One, to give the company's tractors a modern silhouette to match their modern color. On August 9, 1939, at a Farmall Day celebration held appropriately enough in Rock Island, Illinois, IH introduced the Loewy-styled Farmall H and M, the start of what came to be called the letter series. Loewy gave the H its distinctive silver pinstriping and three-dimensional nameplate, designed the offset Cultivision seating that let a driver see his row ahead of him rather than over the engine, and in 1946 designed the IH logo itself, a lowercase I set inside an uppercase H, meant deliberately to suggest the silhouette of a man driving a tricycle front Farmall. That logo would still be visible, slanted and slightly altered, on Case IH equipment built decades after the company that commissioned it had stopped existing. The letter series became the best-selling tractor lineup in American history. Between 1939 and 1954, International Harvester built more than 1 million letter series Farmalls. The H alone, a modest two-plow machine aimed at the 100-acre farmer still transitioning off horses, sold somewhere around 390,000 to 420,000 units, depending on how the later Super H variants are counted, at prices that started around $850 and climbed towards $1,650 by the early 1950s. Only the Ford 8N, helped along by Ford's economies of scale and a lower sticker price, ever outsold it in North America. The Farmall H remains, to this day, the best-selling row crop tractor ever built by any manufacturer. It is worth pausing on what that color did, because this audience already knows, but it is worth saying out loud anyway. A farmer driving past a neighbor's place did not need to read a nameplate to know what he was looking at. Red in the machine shed meant International Harvester. Green next door meant Deere. Orange 2 farms over meant Alice Chalmers. The color was the brand, visible from the county road at 60 miles an hour, and for the better part of half a century, IH Red was one of the 2 or 3 most common colors in rural America, alongside Deere's Green, riding the same fence lines, sharing the same grain elevators, competing for the same handshake at the same implement dealership on the same Saturday morning. If you ask a man who farmed through the 1960s which International Harvester tractor he'd want back most, more often than not the answer isn't the classic M or the beloved Farmall H from the letter series. It's a tractor that arrived almost at the end of the company's independent life, when IH was trying urgently to prove it could still out-engineer John Deere.
That tractor is the Farmall 1206. The 1206 arrived for the 1965 model year, built at the very Farmall Works in Rock Island, whose parking lot we started in, and it mattered for one specific reason. It was the first row crop tractor from any manufacturer to cross the 100 horsepower threshold. The 1206 ran a 5.9-liter, 6-cylinder, water-cooled International Harvester diesel engine producing 122 horsepower, fed by a turbocharger at a moment when turbocharging a farm tractor was still close to a novelty. It carried 8 forward speeds and 4 reverse, independent and dual PTO options, and for farmers stepping up from a 90 horsepower Farmall, a genuinely new category of pulling power in a chassis still narrow enough to run row crops. It was not a tractor built in huge numbers. Listings and auction records for the model consistently note totals in the range of roughly 8,400 units across its production run, which ended in 1967, making a clean original 1206 something close to a unicorn at a county show today. A new 1206 in the mid-1960s would have run a farmer somewhere in the range of $8,000 to $10,000 depending on configuration, real money on a 1965 ag balance sheet. 60 years later, the same machine moves through the auction circuit for anywhere from the high teens to mid-50s. A fully restored 1965 example, completely disassembled and rebuilt down to a new turbo, radiator core, and every bearing in the tractor, sold through Meckham Auctions in November 2021 for $54,600, while rougher, unrestored running examples still regularly change hands in the $13,000 to $20,000 range. The gap between those two numbers is the gap between a tractor and an heirloom. Men who ran the 1206 in the field talk about it the way other generations talk about a first car. The phrase that turns up again and again on tractor forums and in the captions men post alongside photographs of the machines they still own is almost always some version of the same sentence. Original paint, runs and drives well, has a nice turbo whistle to it. That whistle, the distinct rising note of a turbocharged diesel under load, pulling a 6-plow through black Iowa dirt, was new to most of the men who heard it for the first time in 1965. It was the sound of a company that still believed it could outbuild Deere on raw engineering, one more season at a time. For a farmer running 200 or 300 acres in the mid-1960s, the jump from a 90 horsepower Farmall to a turbocharged 1206 wasn't a luxury upgrade. It was the difference between needing 2 tractors in the field at once and needing one. A bigger plow, a wider disc, a faster pass before rain came through. All of it became possible with an engine that could pull harder without the operator needing to baby the throttle. Sellers describing surviving examples today still reach for the same handful of details that mattered then and matter again now to a buyer who knows exactly what he's looking at. Whether the torque amplifier still shifts cleanly under load, whether the tractor carries its original sheet metal, whether the dual
Hydraulics and dual PTO that made the 1206 genuinely versatile in the field are still intact and original to the machine. None of that vocabulary has changed in 60 years, because the men trading these tractors today are in some cases the same men, or their sons, who specified those same options on a dealer's order form the first time around. This was IH near its commercial peak. In 1923, the company's U.S. farm equipment sales of $150 million tripled those of second-place Deere & Co. And even 4 decades later, when the 1206 rolled out of Rock Island, the company that built it still employed thousands of men along that same riverfront, still ran a dealer network that stretched into nearly every county courthouse town in the Corn Belt, and still painted everything it built the same red Raymond Loewy had chosen almost 30 years before. What almost nobody standing on that assembly line in 1965 could have predicted was that the company building the finest row crop tractor in America would not survive to see the century out. By the late 1970s, International Harvester was a company that looked from a distance like it was finally getting its house in order, and that appearance of order is precisely what destroyed it. In 1977, the board brought in Archie McArdle, an outsider with a resume from Ford and Xerox, to do what generations of McCormick family management never quite managed: shake the company loose from decades of conservative in-house promotion and slim profit margins. The board paid handsomely for the privilege. McArdle's package reportedly included a salary in the range of $450,000 to $460,000, a signing bonus of roughly $1.5 million, and a $1.8 million loan at a favorable interest rate that the company promised to forgive outright if he outperformed IH's competitors, terms that struck rank-and-file workers as galling even before the company asked them to give anything up. McArdle moved fast. He set out to cut spending by $640 million and launched an $879 million 3-year plan to modernize aging plants and build new ones, and on paper it worked. 1979 brought International Harvester record sales of $8.4 billion and all-time profit of $370 million. The new axial flow combine was a hit. A dealer in Belvidere, Illinois sold 24 combines that year alone. Everything briefly pointed up. Then McArdle turned to the union.
When the United Auto Workers contract expired on November 1, 1979, McArdle saw an opportunity to roll back work rules the union had held since a 1950 master agreement, chiefly the right of a transferring worker to claim any open job in the company by seniority and the absence of any mandatory overtime clause. He went into the negotiation believing the company's strong financial position gave him leverage. The union read it differently. At noon on November 1, 1979, roughly 35,000 UAW workers, about 36% of International Harvester's entire workforce, walked out of 21 plants across 8 states. The strike lasted 172 days. It would become, at the time, the longest in UAW history. International Harvester's own negotiators were inexperienced. The company aired its bargaining demands in public in a way that hardened the union's position rather than softening it, and union members later told reporters that company officials acted arrogant and aloof throughout, in one remembered instance sending armed guards to watch laid-off workers clear out their lockers. The strike ended on April 20, 1980, with the union retaining nearly everything it had been asked to give up. One Wall Street analyst summed up the outcome in a single sentence that IH's own management could not dispute. There is no question the company is the big loser in this one. Estimates of the direct cost to the company range from roughly $500 to $600 million, a figure equivalent to more than $2.5 billion today. The timing could not have been worse. While the plant sat idle, International Harvester's own management made a catastrophic bet. Convinced that dealers would need to restock heavily once the strike ended, the company kept building trucks and farm equipment through the walkout using whatever skeleton crews it could muster, filling lots with inventory nobody had ordered. Then, on January 1, 1980, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to the invasion of Afghanistan, instantly cutting projected 1980 grain exports by some 17 million metric tons and sending commodity prices and farmer confidence into a slide. The dealers didn't restock. They couldn't. International Harvester came out of its own strike sitting on thousands of unsaleable tractors it had built for a market that had vanished while the plants were shut. There is a document in the corporate record, cited by historians and confirmed by the company's own fiscal filings, that shows precisely how bad the bleeding became. The date on it is not the one most people assume. It isn't 1985, the year IH sold its farm equipment business. The real wound opened years earlier. For fiscal years 1980, 1981, and 1982 combined, International Harvester posted losses of $2.4 billion, at the time the largest 3-year loss any American company had ever recorded. Fiscal 1980 alone brought losses of nearly $400 million. Fiscal 1981 brought $635.7 million more on sales of $7 million. The company suspended its common stock dividend in June 1981, something it had paid without interruption for 71 years. It sold its profitable solar turbines division to its rival Caterpillar for $500 million just to raise cash. Corporate officers took a 29% pay cut. Salaried wages were frozen. And still the company went hat in hand to 225 creditor banks in 1981, begging for 3 more years to restructure nearly $5 billion of debt. This was the moment the broader farm economy turned against every equipment maker in the country, not just International Harvester, but IH had no cushion left to absorb it. What farmers and historians alike now simply call the 1980s farm crisis was by any measure the worst agricultural downturn since the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve's effort to break the inflation of the late 1970s pushed interest rates as high as 21.5% by 1981, and farmers who had borrowed heavily against rising land values during the boom years of the 1970s found that collateral evaporating under them. Farmland in Iowa lost roughly 60% of its value between 1981 and 1986 alone, and similar declines hit Minnesota, Illinois, and the rest of
Corn Belt. Total farm debt, fueled by that same borrowing, climbed to roughly $215 billion by 1984, double what it had been only 6 years earlier. And economists at the time estimated that a third or more of American farmers were in serious financial trouble. Foreclosure notices became a fixture of small-town newspapers. Rural communities organized suicide prevention hotlines specifically for farmers. By 1985, the crisis was severe enough that a benefit concert called Farm Aid was organized in Champaign, Illinois, drawing musicians and 70,000 people to raise money for families losing their land, itself a measure of how widely the suffering had spread beyond the farms themselves and into the small towns, dealerships, and equipment manufacturers that depended on them. Equipment manufacturers across the Corn Belt watched their order books empty out in a single season, and IH, already drowning in debt from the McArdle years and the strike that broke them, had nothing left to fall back on. The company's new 50 Series and 30 Series tractors, genuinely innovative machines styled by industrial designer Greg Montgomery, landed in dealer lots in 1981 and 1982 to almost no buyers at all. It wasn't the tractors. It was the moment. Even before the strike, there were signs the company was reaching for answers it couldn't quite engineer its way to. In 1979, IH introduced a 4-wheel drive line nicknamed the 2+2, the 3388 and 3588, essentially 2 existing tractor rear ends bolted together with a transfer case between them, followed a year later by the 3788. The articulated design let the tractors turn far tighter than a conventional 4-wheel drive machine, and in the field they performed well. They never sold in the numbers IH needed. It was the story of the company in miniature. Clever engineering,
genuinely competent machines, arriving into a market that no longer had the appetite or the credit to absorb them. On May 3, 1982, one day after the union ratified a deeply concessionary contract, International Harvesters Board fired Archie McCardle. Reporting at the time noted what almost everyone inside the industry already believed: the real wonder was that it hadn't happened sooner. But firing the man who broke the company did not unbreak it. By 1984, with the banks no longer willing to extend further patience, International Harvester reached a deal with Tenneco, the conglomerate that controlled the Case Corporation, to sell its entire agricultural equipment division. The sale closed in November 1984. The combined operation took a new name, Case IH, and the company that had built the Farmall, the McCormick Deering, and the 1206 was no longer in the business of building tractors for American farmers at all. The closure didn't happen all at once, and that slow unwinding is, in some ways, crueler than a single announcement would have been. The plant closure at Farmall Works had effectively been decided the moment the Tenneco deal closed, since Case already had its own tractor assembly capacity at its Racine, Wisconsin plant and had no use for a duplicate facility on the Mississippi. The ceremonial end came on May 14, 1985, when the last tractor, a Model 5488, rolled off the Rock Island line in front of roughly 5,000 Farmall retirees and their families who had come to watch. It was not a celebration. People who were there describe it as something closer to a wake. The plant limped on making parts with a shrinking crew into early 1986, before finally going dark for good on June 27th of that year, 60 years almost to the day after International Harvester first opened the building in 1926. What that closure took from Rock Island is not abstract. At its peak in the 1950s, the Farmall Works ran 1.9 million square feet of floor space across 49 acres, employed roughly 5,000 workers directly, and turned out 350 tractors a day. By some local estimates, a plant that at its height employed something close to a quarter of the entire working population of Rock Island, either on the line itself or in the businesses that served the men who worked there. When Tenneco forced the closure, more than a third of the nation's entire capacity to build large farm tractors disappeared with it. The Quad Cities region, Rock Island, Moline, East Moline, and their Iowa neighbors across the river, a place that had once called itself the farm implement capital of the world, lost more than 20,000 manufacturing jobs across the decade as Harvester and its competitors collapsed in the same few years. Rock Island's population fell by roughly 8,000 people through the 1980s, according to census figures, and the city's equalized assessed valuation, the tax base that paid for its schools and its streets, was cut in half. The building itself stood empty and half-used for 2 decades before the wrecking crews finally arrived. Demolition began in earnest in 2009, and within months the structure that workers had called Big Red for 60 years was gone. Its 100-year-old pillars, its lockers still carrying stickers from the Cub tractor line, its 1.5 million square feet, hauled away as scrap. Today, roughly a quarter of the old footprint has new life. McLaughlin Body Company, an auto parts manufacturer, consolidated its operations into a 525,000 square foot remnant of the original plant in 2018, and a bakery occupies another corner. The rest, the other 3/4 of what was once the largest tractor factory on the Mississippi, is parking lot and open grass, with nothing left standing to tell a visitor what used to be there at all. When the auctioneers finally came to clear out what remained of International Harvester's farm equipment inventory in the mid-1980s, men who had spent careers building these machines stood in rooms full of nearly new tractors and watched them sell for a fraction of what they'd cost to build. Dealers across the Corn Belt liquidated lots of unsold 50 Series and 30 Series tractors, machines barely 2 years old, fully engineered, beautifully styled, at prices that reflected not what they were worth, but what a market in freefall would bear. People who watched it happen described rooms that had gone strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over an auction when everyone present understands they are not just watching equipment change hands, but watching something end.
Unlike most failed brands, International Harvester never actually disappeared from view. It just stopped being a company and became something closer to a faith. The National International Harvester Collectors Club organizes chapters across the country and as far as Canada, holding regional shows, a Red Power Roundup that has run for more than 30 consecutive years, and winter conventions where members compare restorations of farmalls spanning every one of the line's 7 generations. The chapters themselves are organized the way the old dealer network used to be, by state and region, each one fiercely proud of its own collection of survivors, each one keeping its own newsletter alive with restoration updates, show schedules, and the kind of detail that only matters if you've spent a winter chasing a fuel injection problem with your bare hands. In August 2023, at the Half Century of Progress show on the grounds of a decommissioned Air Force base in Rantoul, Illinois, organizers from the Central Illinois IH Collectors, Chapter 10, pulled off something that would have been unthinkable to the men who watched the last 5488 roll off the Rock Island line in 1985. 100 Farmall tractors, lined up in chronological order, one for every single year the model had been built, marking the Farmall's 100th anniversary. The same show, 2 years later, drew a turnout of 263 Farmall 1206s alone, the very golden model built at the very plant that no longer exists, hauled in from owners across the country who wanted nothing more than to park their tractor next to 262 others just like it and talk about them for a weekend. There is something almost defiant in a gathering like that. Nobody pays an entry fee, hires a trailer, and drives a 60-year-old tractor 400 miles because a corporation told them to. They do it because the machine still means something the company that built it no longer can. Somewhere in rural Indiana or downstate Illinois tonight, a member of one of these chapters is timing a magneto or chasing a fuel injection problem on a tractor his own father bought new from a dealership that closed before he was born. The company that built that tractor has not existed in any operational form for 40 years. The knowledge of how to keep it running has nowhere left to come from but other collectors, old service manuals kept in 3-ring binders, and the patient trial of taking something apart and putting it back together correctly. That knowledge is not corporate property anymore. It belongs entirely to the people who choose every season to keep it alive. International Harvester Red did not fade from the American landscape because a better color came along. It faded because the company that made that paint made a series of choices about labor, about debt, about how hard to push a workforce that had kept faith with it for generations, that no amount of engineering excellence in a turbocharged 6-cylinder diesel could outrun. The 1206 was by any honest measure one of the finest tractors built in its era. It did not save the company that built it, because the crisis that killed International Harvester was never really about tractors at all. It was about a 172-day strike either side could afford, a debt load no farm economy in freefall could service, and a decade in which the land itself stopped being able to support the machines that had been built to work it. That is the part of this story that matters beyond Rock Island, beyond Farmall Works, beyond any one company's balance sheet. The farms that ran red tractors didn't all vanish when International Harvester did. Many of them are still there, still being worked, often by the grandchildren of the men who bought 1206s new. But the world that needed thousands of independent equipment dealers, each one selling and servicing one brand with the loyalty of a marriage, the world where a neighbor could read your politics and your history off the color in your machine shed, that world went down with the companies that built it. A century earlier, it had taken a banker to end the harvester wars and build something 250,000 farmers could trust by the color of its paint. It took a strike, a grain embargo, and a decade of broken land values to take it apart again, and no banker this time arrived to put it back together. The tractors survived because people loved them enough to keep them running past the point where loving them made any economic sense at all. The way of life that made owning one mean something in the first place did not get the same mercy. If you grew up on one of these, or if your father did, or his father before him, you already know everything in this video that the records and the auction sheets can't tell you. The next story in this series is about a color that meant just as much on a different kind of farm, built by a company in Wisconsin that bought a merger would save it. If that's a memory you carry too, it's one you want to hear.